Okay, so thanks everyone for attending today's AFMS seminar. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Abhishek Pillai, he is an assistant professor at the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Science at Kyoto University, where he also completed his PhD. So Abhishek's main research interest is in turbulent combustion, and he performs high performance computing numerical simulations such as DNS and LES. And he's going to be talking about some of this work today. So please take it away, Abhishek.
Thank you very much, Kat, and good evening, everyone. So I'll start my talk so this is the outline, right? So first I'll start by giving a brief introduction of the kind of research activities we are doing here at Kyoto University. Then I'll go into today's main topic, which is heat transfer characteristics of wall impinging spray flame. So we performed a set of numerical simulations to analyze this phenomenon. And finally, I'll give you some future perspectives on like what lies ahead, where do we go forward from here. Okay, so I work at Kyoto University, as Kat already mentioned, and Kyoto is a city in Japan located over here. It's quite far from Tokyo. And in Kyoto University, we have three major campuses, and these are the pictures of these campuses. So this is the main campus, the oldest one, called Yoshida. But I work in this campus called Katsura, which is where the Graduate School of Engineering is located. And this is a quite new campus. And this campus, as you can see, these are some bird's eye view snaps of our campus. And it's located on top of a hill overlooking the city of Kyoto. Quite a beautiful place to work, and it's very calm. And the laboratory in which I work is called the Thermal Science and Engineering Laboratory. So the head of our laboratory is Professor Yoichi Kurose, and he was also my PhD supervisor when I was doing my PhD in Kyoto University. So regarding the kind of research that we conduct in our group, so you can see we tackle a wide range of combustion problems. So we do simulations mainly of gaseous combustion, two-phase flow, that is spray combustion, and also pulverized core combustion. And our recent studies have mainly been focusing on thermoacoustic instabilities, combustion noise. This was actually part of my PhD thesis, that's combustion noise. And we are also doing a wall-bounded reacting flow. So today's topic is actually a wall-bounded reacting flow kind of problem. And then we also do detonation, application of artificial neural networks, multi-phase flows, atomization, so the whole package. And you can get like more information. I'll put some URL links here, so you can later on go visit our lab's website and have a look at these. And we are also having active collaboration with a lot of industry people, like companies here in Japan as well as abroad. So today's topic is actually work that we did in collaboration with Toyota Central R&D Laboratories. And whenever we are collaborating with these industries, we do like these kinds of large simulations on supercomputers. So some of that work you can have a look at this link. So before I go into the main topic, I'll just give just like a brief gist of some of the recent work that we did. So what you see on this slide is a study we performed on flame propagation in flame spread along fuel droplet arrays. So we did a detailed investigation of the flame propagation characteristics using this level set approach. So this approach can actually resolve your gas-liquid interface. So you're actually resolving your droplets in the computational domain. And then we benchmarked these simulations with against experiment, and we also verified the applicability and the prediction accuracy of the computationally cheaper PSI cell approach. So sorry, just a moment. Yeah, so this PSI cell approach basically treats your droplets, fuel droplets as point masses, right? So we also applied that. And you can find the findings of this research are published in this paper. So after having performed, this flame propagation along droplet arrays, now we are applying this PSI cell approach based simulations to flame propagation in the spray mist. And this is an ongoing work being done by one of our PhD students. And then this is combustion noise. So this was actually my PhD thesis topic. What I did was so at that time I used this concept of the hybrid Cfdca approach to calculate the combustion noise. So what you basically do is you have a two-step approach. So in the first step, you are calculating the reacting flow field of a flame. So what I'm showing here, these animations are for turbulent non-premixed hydrogen flame. It's from the TNF workshop. That's usually, it's used for benchmarking purposes. So you do the DNS, and from the DNS solution, you can get the acoustic sources that are exciting the combustion noise. And once you get those sources, you can then interpolate them from the DNS grid onto a computational aeroacoustic simulation grid, that is the CAA simulation. And what you see here, these gray perturbations are nothing but the acoustic pressure, and the orangish contours are the interpolated acoustic source sum. So basically in this simulation, you are solving a system of they are called APERF. These are kind of like a linearized Euler equations, but not exactly, it's slightly different. So you solve this system of equation which governs the acoustic wave propagation. And you can, this way you can calculate and predict combustion noise. So after the benchmarking, we applied this, this hybrid CFDCA approach to one of the ethanol spray flame from Professor Masri's group, which I think a lot of you must be familiar with. So this ETF3 frame, we did the DNS and also computed the combustion noise. And the findings are published in this combustion and flame paper. So please have a look if you're interested in it. And this is last year, I think 1 or 2 years before, we had started this spray combustion instability study in backstep flows. So what we tried to investigate in this, using these large AD simulations, is that how the combustion instability influences the, the atomization of the fuel spray, and how, if you try to modulate the flow rate of the fuel spray, how it influences the combustion instability. And this is a recent paper that just published last year in Combustion and Flames, so you can have a look. So I'll just show you a couple of animations. So here you see the larger simulation of this backstep flow. You can see the recirculating zone over here where the flame is stabilized. And if you look at these points from which the fuel spray is injected, you will see that the flow rate is not constant. So what we did is we modulated the fuel flow rate, and we also applied like a phase difference between the pressure oscillations and the fuel flow rate variations to see how it, whether it enhances or suppresses the combustion instability. And then what we did is we also tried to study the effect of the combustion instability on the atomization of the spray itself. So here you see that the fuel spray which is being injected in the cross flow is actually, when it is injected, so depending on the local conditions, like, because when the combustion instability is occurring, you have velocity fluctuations as well of the incoming airstream. So because of those fluctuations, you can actually see that the droplet size distribution keeps varying in time, right? So this red line that is traversing, it shows the time instance, the progression of time. And you can see that the pressure oscillates and the velocity is oscillating because of the combustion instability process. But you also see that the Sota mean diameter of the injected spray is also varying, is like oscillating in time. So this was, we've got some really interesting observations from this work. And all the animations that I'm going to show, I've shown so far, and more can be found on our lab's website. So go check it out if you are interested. Okay, so let's start today's topic, right? So this is the the heat transfer characteristics of wall impinging spray flames under CI engine-like conditions. So I'll start with a brief background as to why we conducted this study. So as you know, we want to mitigate the challenges of climate change, and many countries are now setting ambitious targets to slash their CO2 emissions. And if we analyze the breakdown of global CO2 emissions, you will see that the road transport industry, which is vital for any economy, accounts for roughly 16% of the global CO2 emissions. So the need of the hour is we want to develop, thermal, CI engines, that is compression ignition engines, with much better thermal efficiencies. And one way to do that is to reduce the heat loss through the wall that occurs in these engines. And this can actually account for roughly 30% of the combustion energy in some cases. So if you see the inside view of an engine, right? So here you have the spray flame that is impinging on a wall. So there's going to be heat transfer from this flame to the wall. And this is what we want to predict accurately using numerical simulations. So if we can do that, before actually even designing or producing the engine, that would be very helpful in the initial design stages. So in this regard, many researchers have proposed correlations for the heat transfer coefficients since the 20th century. So in some previous experiments, what they investigated was the effect of fuel injection pressure, combustion, the combustor size on the wall heat loss. So based on the principle of convective heat transfer, many researchers have proposed correlations between the Nusselt number and the Reynolds number, as shown here. So basically the Nusselt number has a power law dependence on the Reynolds number. And many researchers did the experiments, and they found like different values for these for this correlation index. So the first, one of the very first works was by a guy called researcher called Washney. So what Washney did was he applied the analogy of non-reacting turbulent flow in pipes to the flow inside these IC engines, and he reported a correlation like this where the value of n was 0.8. But the issue with this is this has not been, it's not verified whether this correlation is applicable during the combustion period of a CI engine. And recent experiments have shown that there is significant deviation in this correlation, the correlation index value from the one that was originally proposed by Washney. And what is alarming is that many industry, even in industry today, people still sometimes stick to this, Washney's correlations when they do the 0D cycle simulations. So when I talk about recent experiments, it is the one; those are the ones performed by Inagaki et al. And Fujikawa et al. In Japan. So based on their recent experiments with diesel spray combustion, in CI engine-like environment, they reported the correlation index value of 0.4 and 0.29. So as you can see, there is a wide variation from that of the previous, like the older experiments. Now, one of the main reasons why such deviations or why such differences could arise is the way in which we are defining these Nusselt and Reynolds number while performing the experiments. Now, depending on the experiment, there could be physical constraints and some restrictions in the experimental setup itself, which would make it difficult to consider the detailed, spatial distributions and temporal evolution of, let's say, the flame temperature, the gas phase velocities, wall heat flux, etc. And another reason could be that when these experiments were performed, the heat flux that is measured in the experiments might implicitly include the contribution of the radiative heat flux. So as we all know from our fundamental understanding of heat transfer, we know that Nusselt number is only defined for convection heat transfer problems, right? But when you are calculating the Nusselt number from a heat flux which has the contribution of radiative heat transfer in it, so you can get deviations in the value of this n. Right? So what can we do instead of experiments? How do we solve this issue? So one way is to use numerical simulations. But the problem is that this phenomenon, to simulate these impinging spray flames, or rather wall impinging spray flames, it's a complex phenomenon. So there aren't many studies out there right now. And there are a few ones, but they might have neglected some physics while performing the simulations. So one example is that done by Hori et al. Recently, and they investigated the effect of fuel injection pressure on wall heat loss. And but in those simulations, they did not take into account the changes in the wall temperature due to the heat transfer from the flame, nor did they consider the effect of radiative heat transfer. So this is why our research purpose is to perform 3D numerical simulations of these wall impinging spray flames to investigate their combustion characteristics and to analyze in detail the effect of the fuel injection velocity on the total heat flux and the total heat flow rate at the wall surface. So basically, when I say total heat flux, it's the sum of the convective and the radiative heat flux. So the difference between our simulations and the past simulations is that the previous studies is that we couple the heat conduction occurring within the solid wall with so there is heat conduction occurring inside this finite thickness wall, and we couple it with the spray combustion calculations. And we are also considering the radiative heat transfer from soot and other gaseous combustion products. So I'll just start with some, I'll give you some brief overview of the governing equations and the models that were used in this study. So, I mean, you might be all familiar with the governing equations of this gas phase. So we solved this gas phase in the classical Eulerian coordinate framework, right? And for the gas phase calculations, so we are basically solving the continuity, momentum, enthalpy, mixture fraction, and progress variable transport equations. So we adopted this flamelet approach as the combustion model here, and particularly we are using the non-adiabatic version of the flamelet progress variable approach, right? So the reason why we are using this non-adiabatic version is because we want to account for the heat loss through the wall and the heat loss due to the evaporation of fuel droplets, right? And in these equations, you see these source terms that are marked by these blue circles. And these are the source terms for the interaction between the dispersed phase fuel droplets and the gas phase. And they are evaluated using the PSI cell approach, that is the particle source in cell approach. And while for the, this flamelet approach, we use a pre-tabulated flamelet database, which is also called a flamelet library. And that was generated using the Flame Master code by solving the flamelet equations for a 1D counter diffusion flame. And for generating the, generating this flamelet library, we used this detailed chemical reaction mechanism consisting of 255 species and 2,289 reactions for endodecane. So in these simulations, endodecane is used as the fuel spray. So just to clarify about this this non-adiabatic flamelet progress variable approach, or the NAFPV approach. So the thermochemical properties, such as mass fraction of the chemical species, reaction rate, these can be obtained from the flamelet library using a reduced set of control variables, which are the mixture fraction and the progress variable and the enthalpy loss. So this enthalpy loss is basically accounting for your heat loss to the cooled wall or the latent heat of evaporation of fuel droplets. And also it can account for the radiative heat transfer. So everything is included in this control variable. And then for the dispersed phase, that is the fuel droplets, we track them individually in a Lagrangian framework as point masses by solving the governing equations for droplets position, velocity, its temperature, and its mass. And for the evaporation of the fuel droplets, we are using a non-equilibrium Langmuir-Knudsen model. So next up is this spray wall interaction model. So why we need this model is in this kind of wall impinging spray frame problems, once the fuel is injected into the chamber, the spray will directly hit the wall, and some droplets which have not yet evaporated and have not yet been consumed in the combustion reactions, they will hit the wall and form a liquid pool or a liquid film over the wall surface. So this spray wall interaction phenomena can be modeled by a combination of what we call a spray film interaction model. This was proposed by Stanton and Rutland. It's actually it's not a new model. It's been in existence for a while now. And we also use this wall film dynamics model proposed by O'Rourke and Amsden. So in this spray wall interaction model, the spray wall interaction phenomena itself is classified into 4 regimes based on the impinging droplet's Weber number. So the droplet can either stick to the film, it can rebound, or it can spread, or it can splash, depending on its Weber number. And this wall film dynamics model is actually a particle-based method. So again, this is a Lagrangian framework used to model the dynamics and evaporation of the liquid film that is formed on the wall surface. So basically, the wall film that is formed here is assumed to be constituted of several discrete spherical particles, as illustrated by this schematic diagram. So just a brief introduction to this wall film dynamics model. So in this model, we use something called a thin film assumption. So this assumption is valid as long as your film thickness does not exceed 100 microns. So these are the assumptions. So what we assume is that the liquid flow inside the film is laminar, and the liquid velocities inside the film are tangential to the wall surface. And we also assume that the velocity profile inside the film varies linearly with height above the wall. And again, then we assume that the film pressure arises entirely from the impingement of the spray, and the temperature profile within this thin film is assumed to be piecewise linear. So with these assumptions, we solve the mass, momentum, and energy conservation equations of the film. And these equations are coupled to the computations of the gas phase as well as the wall. The next model that we have is, of course, radiation, because radiation is important. So for the computation of radiative heat transfer, we solve the radiative transfer equation shown here by the discrete ordinates method with S8 quadrature. So what we are doing is this equation for the radiative heat transfer is replaced by a discrete set of equations for a finite number of ordinate directions. So the S8 quadrature means you are solving for 80 rays of light that are responsible for the radiation emission. And so once we solve for the radiation, then in the enthalpy conservation equation, you get a source term which accounts for the radiation from species like so in this study, the species that radiate energy are H2O and then CO2, CO, and soot. And we assume that all of these, all these species are gray, or gray, like gray gases. And so from the discrete ordinate method, you can calculate this radiation source term, and you can close this equation. So regarding the soot, so soot is actually the dominant radiating species here. And so the soot formation is predicted using the well-known Moss-Brooks model in the present simulations. In this model, we are solving the transport equations for the soot number density and mass density to predict the soot formation due to inception, coagulation, surface growth, and oxidation. And this is the, yeah, so, and the last, I wouldn't say this is a model. This is basically, we are also incorporating the conjugate heat transfer. So the purpose of using this conjugate heat transfer in the simulations is to couple the convective and radiative heat transfer occurring over the wall surface with the conduction heat transfer occurring inside this solid wall. So to the temperature variation inside the wall is computed by solving the 3D transient heat conduction equation. And we assume that the wall material is steel. The total wall heat flux at the gas wall interface and the film wall interface is obtained by solving these equations. So the convective heat flux is calculated based on the Fourier law, because at the wall surface, the fluid velocity is 0. So at the wall surface, you want to calculate the convective heat flux is the same as the conductive. So you use the Fourier's law, and sorry, yeah, and the radiative heat flux is, we already have the value from the discrete ordinates method that I mentioned previously. So the total heat flux is basically the sum of the convective and the radiative heat fluxes. And the heat flux balance equation at the gas wall interface must be solved implicitly under the constraint that the gas phase temperature and the temperature, the wall temperature at the gas wall interface are equal. And you do the similar exercise for the film wall interface. And this way we can calculate the interface temperatures for both the gas wall and the film wall interfaces. Now, I'll show you the computational configuration, the domain that we use in these simulations. So this, the 3D computational domain is shown in this schematic. And this configuration corresponds to the experimental setup used in the previous investigation performed at Toyota. So we are using the same kind of domain. The liquid, as I said, is endodecane, and initial conditions for this simulation are high pressure and high temperature ambient conditions of 3 megapascal and 1600 Kelvin, respectively. And the initial composition of the domain consists of oxygen, nitrogen, and water vapor in these proportions by volume. So we use again, the no-slip wall boundary condition is applied. And the wall that we use in these simulations has a thickness of 4 mm. And we assume that initially the upper surface of the wall is at 481 Kelvin. And the temperature within the wall varies linearly up to 463 Kelvin at the bottom surface, and the bottom surface is kept isothermal. So these are the fuel spray injection condition. In this study, 3 cases are simulated for different fuel spray injection velocities of 100 meter per second, 150, and 216 meter per second, because we want to investigate the influence of the fuel injection velocity on the wall heat loss. And for each case, the injected droplet size distribution is given by fitting the experimentally measured data using a Rosen-Ramler PDF. So as you can see, the droplet size distribution becomes more biased towards the smaller droplets as the fuel injection velocity increases. And hence you see that the SOTA mean diameter reduces as the fuel injection velocity increases. The total fuel mass injected is 0.64 milligram in each case. And the each simulation is performed until this amount of fuel is injected in each case. And then this table at the bottom shows the total number of grid points used in each case, which is approximately 226 million. And these simulations were performed using 1600 cores on an SGI ICE-X, which is at a research organization called CRIPE in Japan. And the wall clock time and the CPU hour for each simulation are given here. So as you can see, the total CPU hour combined for all the 3 simulations is quite large. Okay, now let's move on to the results and discussion. So first I'll show you some results for the combustion field. So here, these animations are showing you the temperature distribution and the droplet behavior in the case 3, where the fuel injection velocity is 216 meters per second. So the left animation depicts the instantaneous distributions of gas phase temperature in the central XZ plane and the YZ plane. That is, this is the on the gas phase temperature distribution on the wall surface. And the fuel droplets that you see that are getting injected from the top, these are colored by their respective evaporation rate. So the right animation is also showing those fuel droplets that are being injected, but here we are showing the instantaneous 3D isosurfaces of the gas phase temperature. So you can see that from these animations, once the fuel is injected, evaporation occurs followed by ignition of the evaporated fuel, and then combustion, and then subsequently the flame impinges on the wall surface that is over here. Next, the temperature distributions of the gas phase in the central XY plane of each case, along with the corresponding temperature distributions in the wall, are presented in these animations. So the gray entities that you see here are the fuel droplets. The enlarged view that I'm showing over here, this shows the wall temperature distribution, rather the temperature distribution inside the wall. And you can see that the temperature near the stagnation point, that is the region where the flame impinges directly on the wall surface, rises the most compared to the other regions in the wall. Okay, so let's have a look, examine the the chemical structure of this spray flame. So I'm only showing the results for case 3 because the results for the other 2 cases are qualitatively similar. The only difference is quantitative. So these figures here show the radial distributions of fuel mass fraction and oxygen mass fraction, then the droplet evaporation rate, and then the reaction rate, and as well as the gas phase temperature. And these radial distributions are plotted at the streamwise location of x equal to 15 mm, that is 15 mm from the nozzle exit. It can be seen that the mass fraction of the vaporized fuel is higher in the near the central region of the jet, because that's where most of the fuel droplets are and they are evaporating. And then judging from these radial distribution, you can see that like a diffusion flame is formed. And these blue bands in these 2 figures, these blue bands show the radial location where the peak reaction rate occurs. And you can see that the core of this spray flame is visibly quite cooler compared to the the outer edges of the free shear layer, because due to the latent heat of evaporation of the fuel droplets. Then considering the flow feed, these isosurfaces of shown here are for the second invariant of the velocity gradient tensor. So these are or rather what you call the Q criteria. So these are isosurfaces for a Q value greater or a positive Q value, which means these are the vorticity dominated regions of the flow field. And it is evident that the turbulence develops in the free shear layer. But once the flame hits the wall, you can see that the turbulence decays quite rapidly as the flame spreads away from this stagnation zone region, which is basically because of the viscous effects in the boundary layer that is formed on the wall surface. Then we also compared these, our simulation results for the case 3 with those of experiments. So the first, we are looking at the instantaneous distributions of the computed soot radiation emission, which is the line of sight integrated emissive power of soot in case 3. And these are compared with the luminous flame photographs from the experiment at different time instances. So the brightness of this luminous flame in the experimental flame photographs can be considered to be proportional to the soot emissive power. But please note that this is not an accurate representation of the flame's radiant power. So therefore, this comparison is only for qualitative purposes. And the results indicate that the distributions of the soot emissive power show reasonable agreement with the flame photographs. Next, we have some more quantitative comparisons. So here I'm showing you two graphs. So the left one is the time variation of the temperature of the stagnation point on the wall surface. And the right one is the time variation of the wall heat flux at the same stagnation point. Again, the results are being shown for case 3 only. And they are compared here with against the experiment. So you can see the temperature shows quite good agreement, but there are some underestimation over here for these time instances. And because of that, you can see that the heat flux is also a bit underestimated here. But the main reason for these discrepancies is that in the experiments, the fuel used was diesel, whereas we are using N-dodecane. So the thermophysical properties and transport coefficients for the, the vaporized fuel as well as the liquid fuel is going to be different. And another issue is that if you remember the initial condition, we set the whole domain to be at a temperature of 1600 Kelvin. But if you look at the experimental result, you see that initially the heat flux is 0. So there is no heat transfer happening. So maybe they let the experimental setup, rest for a bit so that the heat flux becomes 0 at the wall. So the temperature distribution close to the wall or in the near wall region might have been different in the experiment. And also the temperature distribution inside the wall might have been different. So we couldn't account for that because we didn't have that data. So that could be another cause for the discrepancies here. Then let's go to the results of the wall heat flux. So here I'm showing you the time variations of the total wall heat flux. So that is the summation of the convective wall heat flux and the radiative wall heat flux at different radial locations for all the 3 cases. So here you can see that instead of, so although these are the time variations, but on the x-axis, I'm showing the injected mass, injected fuel mass, that is, because it's representative of time. And you can see from these figures that once the flame hits the wall and reaches a particular location, the wall heat flux rises rapidly. And thereafter, it becomes, it stabilizes and becomes roughly steady. And so after looking at the time variations of the heat flux, we also analyzed the radial distributions of the time averaged total wall heat flux for each case, which is shown in this figure, right? And so, so we have case 1, case 2, and case 3. And what we also tried to analyze the separate contributions of the convective and radiative heat fluxes to the total heat flux. So that is shown here for case 1. So these bar graphs are showing you the contributions of both the convective heat flux and the radiative heat flux, and the ratio of the radiative heat flux to the total heat flux is shown as these percentages on top of these stacked column bar graphs. So it can be seen from this figure that the radiative heat flux accounts for a small fraction of the total heat flux at the stagnation point. But however, if we move away from the stagnation point, that is, if we increase the radial distance, this percentage becomes greater. So the reason for this is basically what kind of temperatures are encountered in the different radial locations. So as an example, if you see this figure of the spray flame, so if I look at the probability density function of the gas phase temperature at, let's say, in the region close to the stagnation point, that is R equal to 0, and the region away from the stagnation point, you will see that I'm encountering a lot of lower temperatures in this region compared to this region. So because of this, and the reason here is like near the stagnation point, you have a lot of evaporation, latent heat of evaporation due to the dispersed phase droplets and the liquid film that is formed on the wall surface. So the radiation intensity and the radiative heat flux will be smaller at the stagnation point compared to the other radial locations. So as we move away from the stagnation point, the contribution of radiative heat flux increases. So another observation here is that if we compare the total wall heat flux for all the three cases, we see that with increasing fuel injection velocity, a marked increase in the total heat flux occurs. So the overall trend for the total heat flux is that it's largest at the stagnation point, that is R equal to 0, and reduces with increasing distance from this stagnation point. And the behavior is consistent with the characteristics of the convective heat flux, which has a larger contribution to the total wall heat flux. Now here, I'm showing you just the radial distributions of the time averaged convective heat flux. So from the total heat flux, we just subtract the radiative heat flux, and you can see it is showing the same radial distribution trends as the total wall heat flux. So it is highest at the stagnation point for a given case and reduces with the radial distance. And the higher the fuel injection velocity, the greater the convective heat flux. So we can try to understand how this, the role of turbulent heat transport in promoting the convective heat flux. So for that, we need to analyze the sweep and ejection events occurring close to the wall surface. So first, let's look at the dependence of convective heat flux on the fuel injection velocity. So for this purpose, I have plotted these joint PDF distributions of the temperature fluctuation and the wall normal component of velocity fluctuation, that is U prime, and temperature fluctuation is T prime, for all the three cases, but at the radial location of 0 mm, that is just above the stagnation point. So it is evident from these figures that the higher the fuel injection velocity, the stronger you get these correlations between U prime and T prime. So the sweep ejection events are more frequent. And this indicates that this stronger correlation indicates greater contribution of the sweep and ejections to the turbulent heat transport in the wall normal direction, which leads to enhancement of the convective heat transfer. And next, to understand why understand why the convective heat flux is maximum at the stagnation point and decreases with increasing radial distance from the stagnation point, we consider only the case 3, and we plot the same joint PDF distributions of T prime and U prime for different radial locations. So again, you can clearly see that the correlation is strongest just above the stagnation point. So meaning that the turbulent heat transport is greatly enhanced in the vicinity of the stagnation point due to the largest contributions of the sweep and ejections to the wall normal turbulent heat transport. So Sharam, how much time do I have left?
So you've got about 15 minutes left in the slot, but we'll leave like 5-10 minutes for questions. So maybe 5 to 10 minutes more.
5 to 10 minutes more. Okay. Yeah. So then in that case, I would like to go to one of the major results of the study. So as I mentioned in the beginning, so many experiments tried to find these correlations between the Nusselt and Reynolds number, because we need such correlations if we want to get an accurate estimate of the heat transfer coefficient. So in those studies, what they assumed is, based on the principle of convective heat transfer, they assumed quasi-steady conditions and constant Prandtl number, and came off with the correlation between NU and RE. So we also analyzed what the dependence of the Nusselt number and Reynolds number in using our simulation data. So what we did is we defined 2 types of Nusselt number. So first one is called the total Nusselt number, which is calculated using the total heat flow rate at the wall surface. That is the summation of the convective heat flux and the radiative heat flux. Now this, of course, is not the conventional definition of Nusselt number, but we just want to use the same method. We want to keep our analysis in line with the previous experiments. And then we also calculated the convective Nusselt number, which is the conventional definition of your Nusselt number, by using just the convective heat flow rate. And you will see that there is a bar over some of the quantities here. And these quantities, so the bar indicates spatial and temporal averaging performed in this region, that is the near wall region of the simulations. So once we calculated these Nusselt, two types of Nusselt numbers, and what you can then do is for each case that we simulated, you can get a pair of Nusselt number and Reynolds number. So the left graph shows you the dependence of the total Nusselt number on the Reynolds number, and we plot the pairs of these values of each case, and you take the best fit line. And what it shows you is that the correlation index value is about 0.49. Now, if I do the same analysis for the conventional convective Nusselt number, right, and I try to find its dependence on the Reynolds number, you will see that the correlation index value changes quite a bit. So this shows you the importance of the way you are defining and the way you are measuring these Nusselt numbers in experiments. And even just you might say that radiative heat flux can be neglected, but not always, because in this study we actually found that the radiative heat flow rate accounts for roughly 18 to 30% of the total heat flow rate. So under such conditions, you have to be very careful as to how you are defining this Nusselt number and how you are formulating these kinds of correlations, because it will have a big effect on that correlation. Okay, so these are the conclusions for today's study, but this is not the end of the talk yet. I would like to give some future perspectives. So the major takeaway from these simulations is that the total wall heat flux increases with the fuel injection velocity, and the total wall heat flux is largest in the vicinity of the stagnation point and reduces with increasing radial distance from the stagnation point. So the reason for this was clarified using, by looking at the sweep ejection events that characterize turbulent heat transport. And we found that near the stagnation point, these events are larger and they become more frequent with increasing fuel injection velocity. The next takeaway was that the radiative heat flux at the wall surface becomes larger as the radial distance from the stagnation point increases. And we also, so I didn't show this result, but maybe during the Q&A, I can discuss more about this. We found that the fuel injection velocity doesn't influence the radiative heat transfer that much. But we did find that the radiative heat flow rate ranges from 17%, or rather it's actually 18% to 29.8%, depending on the case. So we had three cases, like case 1, case 2, and case 3. And if you look at these values, you can clearly see that we cannot neglect this. And this has to be considered. So when you are performing experiments and you're trying to formulate a correlation, robust correlation between Nusselt number and Reynolds number, you have to be very careful how you are measuring and defining your Nusselt number. Okay, so before I end my talk, I would just like to give you some future perspectives. So in this work, our main objective was to investigate the dependence of heat loss through the wall on the fuel injection velocity. And we attempted to elucidate the relationship between Nusselt number and Reynolds number relating to wall heat transfer. But however, the fuel injection velocity is not the sole parameter that will influence this phenomenon. There are several other parameters. For example, their initial, or the operating pressure, temperature, your bore size, nozzle diameter, radiative properties of the wall surface itself, the angle at which the spray impinges on the wall, and so on. So there is more work needed to develop robust and improved correlations for these wall impinging spray flames, so that we can develop these correlations and use them for accurately calculating the heat transfer coefficient in CI engines. Now, another aspect that is integral to these kind of spray combustion problems and of particular interest in the combustion engineering community is the liquid atomization process. Now, if you remember, in this study, we did not capture the entire atomization process of the spray that is injected, the endodecane liquid fuel. So this is, but we are working on that. And as you might know, such simulations where we can fully resolve the liquid phase as well and capture the primary atomization can be quite cost prohibitive. And they have been quite cost prohibitive till now. But this is another, this kind of simulation where you can capture this phenomena accurately. The physics of the atomization itself is strongly desired. So far, we have had whatever computational resources we had may not be sufficient to do such kind of, challenging and large scale simulations. So this photo that you see here is that of the K computer. By the way, that's me. When I was a PhD student, this was taken like 5 years ago. And this was, the K computer was Japan's like fastest supercomputer till 2019 when it was decommissioned. Although this was a good machine, but it was not, ready to meet the challenges of the future, because we want to do more computationally intensive or computationally resource intensive simulations. So that's why the Japanese government now decided to decommission the K computer. And this was back in 2014. They started the development of the next generation supercomputer, which is called the Fugaku. Maybe you have already heard about this because it has been in the news recently. And it started operation in on March 9th. So that's last week's Tuesday. And now we are using this supercomputer to perform these kind of large-scale simulations, and we have already planned some large-scale DNS simulations. And this, at the moment, Fugaku is like the fastest supercomputer in the world. So very soon we will be able to perform much more complex spray combustion simulations where we can also take into account this kind of the atomization of the liquid fuel itself, and like we can perform well-resolved simulations in like a maybe brute force manner. So that was my talk for today. Sorry if I sped up, in some parts. I would like to thank Toyota for sharing the experimental data with us, and I would also like to thank the funding agencies of MEXT and JSPS. And I would like to finally, I'm very grateful to AFMS for giving me this opportunity to share our research work with you all. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for that excellent talk. That was a fantastic, for someone who doesn't know that much about combustion, that was like a fantastic overview and introduction to this really complicated fluid dynamics problem. So we've got time for a few questions. If you're in the audience, feel free to unmute and ask.
Yeah, I had a question, Kat. I can go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thanks a lot, Abhishek, for the interesting talk. I'm Tushar, a PhD student from Uni Melbourne. So my question is, I had just a small question regarding your simulation setup, which you showed, the way you were solving equations. So as I understand that you have heat transfer equations as well, which you are solving in transient. So that would be in the solid domain, right? While your main simulations is in the aero domain. So how, so are you running two different domain simulations in parallel? Like how are you integrating?
You're talking about the parallelization aspect of the domain, right?
Yeah, because these are two different domains, right?
Actually, like, yes, these are two different domains, but so, okay, let me go back to this slide. Yeah, so you have the spray combustion part, which is above the wall, right? Here,
right.
This is the gas and your dispersed fuel droplets. And then you have the solid wall. So, of course, there are two different domains, but is your question related to the, the domain decomposition part of MPI or something like that? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, so I mean, the question is just basic. So you have the air domain where all the equations, multi-phase equations are being solved.
Yeah.
While that particular heat transfer transient equation is being solved for the solid domain.
Only this. Yeah, only this region, this 4 mm by, you know, whatever these 2 dimensions are.
Okay,
Only
so
in this part, yeah.
so you are solving the two separately, and for each time step you are integrating the results on each other. Is it like that?
Exactly. And you
Okay,
take so the time step value is, we are taking the smallest of the two, because so the CFD has its own CFL criteria,
right,
and your heat conduction problem has its own Fourier criteria for the time step
right.
value, right? So we take the smallest one and we advance the solutions together using the smallest value.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, thanks. That's
okay, yeah.
all. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question.
We have someone else with their hand up, Vishal, if you would like to ask your question.
Hi, Abhishek. I was
Hi,
just
Vishal.
wondering if you would have thought of actually having a moving wall instead of static wall there, because if you think about the engine, you actually have the piston moving up and down.
Yeah. So at the moment, our in-house code, so this is the code that we use. It's called FK3. Maybe I didn't mention it, I'm sorry. So you can go read up on this code. So I put all the links here for our lab. So at the moment, we are not there yet. Our code cannot handle a moving mesh. But we are now in the process of implementing I think you are familiar with the immerse boundary method.
Yeah.
Right, so we are trying to now also implement that into the code so that in future we can solve like a moving boundary problems. So of course we couldn't do it right now, but this simulation is mainly mimicking the combustion period when your piston is at the TDC and the spray is injected and the flame is impinging on the piston surface.
Right. That's fine. And another point was because if you look at the heat transfer results, they're very similar to, in the, let's say, a canonical case of a jet impinging on a heated
Exactly.
surface. Yeah, but I think there are also studies where they have actually investigated a moving wall, impinging jet on a moving wall, and what actually we see is that an oscillating wall will actually, you know, degrade the heat transfer rate. So this would be something that, I mean, if your code can try to do that, because we have experimental data on a moving wall with the heated jet. So if you can try to compare maybe your simulations with that whenever that's possible, I think that would be a good benchmark.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, can you, so hold on. I think did I put my email ID in the last slide? Yeah, okay. So my email ID is here, okay. Can you just drop an email to me later?
Oh, yeah, sure. All right, I will do that.
So we can discuss,
yep.
Okay, yeah. Because, so at the moment, our code still can't handle with the moving wall. So, but once we have that, of course, we need the experimental data as much as possible for validation. So thank you very much. Yeah.
No worries.
Okay, do we have more questions from the audience?
I can raise my hand, but I have a question. Sorry.
Thanks
for the talk. It was a great talk. I'm just wondering how you imposing your inlet boundary condition for your jet. Do you have some sort of pre-generated turbulence, or is it you actually modeling the nozzle itself, or is it the laminar?
No. So that's the thing. No, it's not. So we are only injecting the fuel droplets. There is no gas phase coming out of the nozzle. Only the discrete, the dispersed phase droplets are coming out in a conical fashion at a specific cone angle. So so if you look at these fuel spray injection conditions, so here, just a moment. Okay, I didn't the cone angle here, but I'll just show you that slide. Okay, so we introduce those droplets in a conical fashion. So each droplet is in, so we inject the droplets using this presumed PDF of Rosin-Ramler in each case. and only droplets are coming out of that nozzle exit. And we don't model the entire nozzle geometry because that would be too computationally expensive. So at the moment, it's not possible. But maybe with the Fugaku, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So there is no turbulence. Only the dispersed phase droplets, like point masses, are being injected into the domain.
Excellent.
All right. Any more questions from the audience? I have a very quick question, so sorry for my ignorance on this. But you mentioned when you were comparing your simulations against the experiments had the diesel. Can you numerically simulate that, or is it there's complications involved, the diesel fuel?
We can. It's just that when we started this collaboration, so Toyota had performed these experiments, well beforehand, but they didn't have the, the data on the diesel. That is, what are the hydrocarbon constituents and in what proportions they are present. So if we had known that data, we could have modeled it into the, the combustion model. So it was just a matter of not having that information.
Okay, understood. Okay, any more questions? Otherwise, I might call the seminar to an end. So thanks again to our seminar speaker today. That was a really fantastic talk. And thanks everyone for attending, and hopefully see you all next week.
Thank you very much again. Thanks to AFMS and the conveners, Kat and Shara. Thank you.